Hey there, friends. It's your pal, David Lightbringer, also known as the Dragon LML. And by the way, that's how you can find me on Twitter, at the Dragon LML. And just a heads up, that's actually the main place that I post most of my loose thoughts on the show during the week and on the weekends. So definitely connect with me there if you're on social media. Anyway, House of the Dragon broke the HBO record for television premieres with 10 million viewers on Sunday. And more importantly, and as you saw yourself, the show is itself fantastic. It's very high quality. So today I thought we'd talk about why the show is so good. That's right, it's 5 things that House of the Dragon is doing well. Most importantly, these are all very promising signs for the future of House of the Dragon. So let's dig in. Alright, the first thing that House of the Dragon did well, and our word for the day, is juxtaposition, which means the fact of two things being seen or placed close together with contrasting effect. So in the context of storytelling, you juxtapose things that you want the reader or viewer to think about at the same time. And of course, the most obvious example of this was the very intense Emma Arryn birth and death scene, which was interspersed with the violent spectacle on the tourney ground. It's readily apparent what's happening here. If they're going to call the birthing bed a battleground, then it can't just be something that they say. They've actually got to explore what that's about. And that violence is further punctuated by being contrasted with the more typical kind of battlefield violence that we are used to seeing and reading about. It's as if to say, you're used to seeing this kind of violence, but we always gloss over this other kind. The idea of the birthing bed being a battlefield comes from A Song of Ice and Fire, of course. It's a line that Lady Cat delivers to Brienne. And I think it's important to George Martin to show all these different forms of violence that he is in the end critiquing. The tourney ground is of course an empty and pointless kind of violence. It's spectacle essentially, but it's also working as a placeholder for actual warfare, which we know is coming in later seasons to consume the lives of many of these soldiers and knights, as well as other men, women, and children, and people of all stripes. Thus, the Emma Arryn jousting violence juxtaposition leaves us asking questions about just what kind of toll this semi-medieval Westerosi society takes on its various members, high and low, male and female. Something else that jumps out with the juxtaposition of these two scenes is the way that Daemon and Viserys both count their victories before they hatch. And yeah, that was a lizard baby joke. You're catching on. So Daemon turns his back on Sir Criston Cole before he's truly defeated, raising his arms in glory to the crowd, and then ends up knocked on his ass and having to give up the match. Viserys, meanwhile, has misinterpreted prophecy to the point where he's certain about his child being a son, and so calls a tournament to celebrate the birth, lifting his arms in glory to the crowd, only to have the entire spectacle turn to ashes in his mouth. So even though these two Targaryen brothers are mostly very different in terms of personality, they're both demonstrating a sort of Dragon Lord hubris here. So the other absolutely fabulous juxtaposition comes at the end of the episode, when Rhaenyra was being named heir. As we watch the mantle of responsibility for the kingdom being placed on Rhaenyra's shoulders in front of the High Lords of that kingdom, we then cut back to the end of Viserys and Rhaenyra's conversation about Aegon's prophecy, a prophecy which makes the Targaryen monarch not only responsible for everyone living in their kingdom today, but for everyone who will ever live in the entire world. So as Rhaenyra continues to gaze upon the proud and fractious lords that she will have to try to rule over and manage, the weight of that extra responsibility really sinks in with us, the viewers, just as we can see it sinking in with Rhaenyra on screen. And to me, that's just a lot more dramatic than doing them one after the other. The conversation with Viserys, and then the ceremony where she's made the heir. So then, after a little bit of that back and forth, a third note is added to the symphony, and that would be Daemon the Outcast, saddling his dragon and leaving King's Landing. This is our first shot of Daemon and Caraxes together, and you can see that they already have a deep connection, and that Daemon almost turns into a soulful, mellow dude when he's soothing Caraxes. And as we cut back to the two other scenes, we then begin to wonder how Daemon's going to handle this, how Rhaenyra will handle Daemon's potential jealousy, and how this big Dragonlord family will manage to hold itself together. So the reason why I'm so excited about juxtaposition is because it's such a key ingredient of Martin's writing. Like, it's kind of the foundation. And here's what I mean. Martin uses a writing technique called in late, out early, like it was a religion. And that basically just means that he begins a chapter with a scene already in progress, and then ends the chapter before the action has totally died back down. Now, to tell stories like this, you have to use flashback to fill in the gaps, and that's exactly what Martin does. That creates natural juxtaposition because the character is periodically remembering how they got in this nutshell as they try to work their way out of said nutshell. The characters' memories float to the surface of their inner monologue according to how Martin wants those memories to contrast against what's happening in the scene. And it makes for very dynamic writing. He does it in literally every chapter, so definitely look for that the next time that you read A Song of Ice and Fire. Characters also create narrative juxtaposition simply by remembering or thinking about all sorts of things as they do other things. And of course, that's just how people operate in the real world. We're almost always thinking about other stuff when we're doing something, unless it's a very intense activity. In any case, I didn't mean to devolve into writing class there, sorry, but this is one of the things that I love the most about Martin's writing. And seeing House of the Dragon make copious use of the television equivalent of this kind of narrative juxtaposition, well, it kind of just makes my heart sing. It's no surprise to hear Ryan Condal, the main scriptwriter for House of the Dragon, say that he's hugely influenced by George's writing. It definitely shows. The next thing that House of the Dragon is doing well is kind of a compliment to juxtaposition, and that's the sort of dreamlike crossfading of scene to scene. For example, as we watch and hear the end of Daemon's violent Gold Cloak crackdown, we're already hearing Sir Otto's disembodied voice from the small council meeting the next day, tattling on Daemon to Viserys. Then as we see Daemon already in his council seat, but looking fully disheveled from the night before, the audience really gets a feeling like this guy was up all night busting heads and chopping off body parts, and then really just rolled straight into the council in his armor, ready with a defense of his actions, which he had to know Sir Otto would question. So the smoothness of the transitions and the overlay of sound and image is what allows this show to cover so much ground in such a natural feeling way. That's extra important since House of the Dragon is very clearly operating in some confined spaces, simply due to the fact that it needs to cover about 20 years of history in Season 1 to set up the actual war. Now, perhaps the best dreamlike crossfade was at the beginning of Daemon setting loose his Hounds of the City Watch. The scene before that was exactly the opposite sort of scene. A quiet, intimate, emotionally fraught scene between Viserys and Aemma, where she is at the same time apologizing to Viserys for failing to bear him a son, which is basically heartbreaking to hear, and also telling him that she simply cannot bear to bury any more dead children, and that this is the last pregnancy that she can handle. So as a director, how do you go from that kind of a scene to the Gold Cloak rampage? Well, what they did was to have the sound of the Watchmen beating on their metal breastplates begin to fade in, but sounding far away and basically like they're underwater. So it essentially sounds like Viserys' pounding headache as the camera shows us Viserys frozen with no response to Aemma's words. Then, as the pounding gets louder and more clear, the scene switches, but our first shot is zoomed in so close on the breastplate that our mind doesn't immediately grasp what we're looking at. Then, as the camera cuts wider, the pounding reaches full throttle, and we're delivered a striking contrast between where these two Targaryen brothers are on this wonderful night in King's Landing. I thought that was real art, and very dreamlike. And overall, I just love the feel of this show that comes from the way that they intercut their scenes. I also think this sort of dreamlike filmmaking style works very well with the time skips that they'll need to do. Alright, so the next thing that House of the Dragon is doing right, which similarly bodes well for its ability to continue to tell us a good story through the end of the show. That's right, the end, every last episode, the last season, the end, the whole thing. Where was I? Yes. The thing it's doing well is embracing fantasy. That's right, embracing fantasy. Dave and Dan were famously kind of uncomfortable with the fantasy elements of A Song of Ice and Fire, and it showed. They didn't quite know what to do with the White Walkers, or Bran's Greenseer powers, or the prince that was promised, Azor High thing, basically all the fantasy elements. They really seemed to just want to get those out of the way in order to get to the evil queen fight, which, don't even get me started on that. House of the Dragon, on the other hand, started off with a princess riding a dragon. And what stuck out to me was how casual it was. Dragons in this show will be everywhere, seemingly, as dragon riders simply ride their dragons to and fro. Pretty much every time a dragon came out on the old show, it was for some big purpose. But here, we will simply have dragons in various scenes, and they might not even be the main thing. That was certainly the case at the funeral of Emma Arryn, where the emotional drama took far more of our attention than the dragon lighting the funeral pyre, which was of course Rhaenyra's Syrax, whose name I never mispronounce. Rhaenyra's dragon ride into King's Landing was also a terrific storytelling choice, as it puts the viewer in Rhaenyra's position as we ourselves are returning to King's Landing and the Red Keep and all the familiar sights and sounds of Westeros. Rhaenyra's exhilaration is our own, and we almost feel like we ourselves just took a dragon ride. So the main point I want to make is that the show seems to be using the same approach to fantasy that George uses in his writing, which is to say, yes, we're going to embrace all the magic and all the classic fantasy tropes, but we're always going to ask, what would real people actually do with these powers and in these circumstances? House of the Dragon is already doing a great job exploring how different Targaryens react to and wrestle with different parts of their magical legacy. So for example, Daemon seems to connect with the dragons pretty intuitively, while Viserys is mostly fearful and reticent of the dragons. But judging from Daemon's quote about "dreams didn't make us kings, dragons did," we can see that Daemon doesn't really trust or maybe understand the prophetic dreaming side of things, which is something that Viserys, on the other hand, embraces and trusts in. And then we have Rhaenyra, who begins the episode looking very in tune with her dragon and professing to prefer adventure and combat to court life. But the episode ends with her being given the crushing weight of Aegon's prophetic knowledge. So she's clearly going to have to wrestle with both ends of that stick. And overall, we can see how all of this magic just kind of reeks of horrible costs and dark promise, misinterpreted prophecy, dragon warfare, and whatever cocktail of Valyrian hubris and abuse of power brought on the doom. Martin is always asking the question of how would people react to all of this? And House of the Dragon seems to be doing very well by asking the same question of its characters. So, similar to the way that the show is exploring the characters having different relationships to their dragons, it's also exploring different people's varying reactions to all the magical elements of the story. Alright, so sticking with the idea of asking the right questions to find the best story, let's talk about fleshing out the details. We knew that Fire and Blood was threadbare, and that the personalities and the details of the characters, as well as almost all of the dialogue, would have to be filled in and fleshed out. As a writer, you have to start this process by asking questions. What would it be like to be in their situation? What kind of motives would make sense of the actions that we hear about them doing in Fire and Blood? For example, there's literally nothing about Rhaenyra and Emma's relationship in Fire and Blood, and almost nothing about Emma herself, really, except the miscarriages and the childbirth death. And yet, from those seeds, the show gave us all that drama. I really liked how Rhaenyra cared more about her mother's safety than who is the heir. I thought it was believable and instantly made us like Rhaenyra, and it helped set up the idea that Emma has this long history of trying to bear a son and having several miscarriages and stillbirths. So I think we'd all agree that Emma left a huge impression on everyone, and not just for the intensity of her final scene. That kind of rapid character development is a skill that's going to be crucial to House of the Dragon's success, as there will be other characters like Emma who are only with us for an episode or two, and they similarly need to have an impact on the viewer while they're there, so that we can fully grasp the story. Now, Viserys is the character whom a lot of people are talking about as being much more fleshed out and interesting than what we saw in Fire and Blood, and that comes both from Paddy Considine's input and from the reveal of Aegon's prophecy, which, by the way, definitely came from George R.R. Martin. Ryan Condal mentioned that on the official House of the Dragon podcast this week. Viserys is still ultimately a weak king, but he's so much more interesting now because they've explored his motivations, both in terms of the burden of prophetic knowledge, as well as the ins and outs of being caught between Daemon and Otto, and the pressure to provide a stable line of succession. Then there's some of the gender stuff for Rhaenyra that Emma Darcy has talked about exploring. Some people have suggested that that's superfluous or an extra thing that's being inserted. But my opinion is that it's simply a matter of asking, what would it be like to be in Rhaenyra's position? What would it be like to be expected to rule over high lords who all grew up thinking of women as being lesser to men? It's inherently a gender struggle because Rhaenyra is literally being given a man's job, quote unquote, but is at clear disadvantage for sake of being born female in that society. And on top of that, Rhaenyra has a dragon, so unlike other women, she has much more ability to transcend her confines and societal boundaries, but will again be held to a different standard than the male dragon lords. So all that flows from simply putting yourself in Rhaenyra's shoes and asking questions, and that's how you flesh out a character. I think that's why George is so utterly thrilled with this show. His skeleton people are coming to life. They've got flesh on the bones now, and they're walking and talking.
Walk it like I talk it. Woo. Walk it like I talk it. You.
All right, last thing before we get out of here, gray characters. That's right, gray characters. It's one of those sayings that kind of loses its meaning when you say it enough, and it's certainly been said enough. But this is what it means, what we're seeing on House of the Dragon. Moment to moment, we might side with or against anyone. King Viserys is a prime example. We kind of hate him by the end of the Emma scene, specifically for not giving her the choice or the chance to come to terms with what was happening. But then we can't help but sympathize with him in the next small council scene when Sir Otto is pressing him way too far right in the midst of his grief. Paddy's acting in that small council scene was absolutely riveting, of course. A lot of people mentioned that. But the point is that we are constantly being asked to reevaluate every character's choices. And there's not really anyone whom you can simply assume is always up to something evil or who always has altruistic and pure motives. We've got to question it all. Daemon's Gold Cloak crackdown is another good example. It starts out looking completely lawless and brutal and senseless, but then Daemon actually makes some pretty good arguments defending his actions that at least make us think. We're left with something like, yeah, his methods were brutal, and it's probably unsustainable to try to keep the peace with such brutality. But Daemon is also right that King's Landing has become crime-ridden and needed to be cleaned up. And you'll notice that Viserys says earlier in the episode that the city has been falling apart since his grandmother died, who would be good Queen Alysanne, by the way, wife of King Jaehaerys, whom we saw in the opening scene of the show. So it's murky. I mean, no one is crying if a rapist is gelded, but we have to ask, was every person that received Daemon's harsh punishment really a criminal? I mean, I don't see any trials or lawyers there, I don't see a lot of due process going on. Gray characters, in other words, aren't unrelatable, as some people say. They're simply people caught in very tough situations where there usually aren't very ideal answers. I think we're pretty much all up in the feels of a bunch of these people already. And already the show has generated a lot of excellent discussion about some pretty intense topics. Alright guys, thanks for watching this video. It's a little bit longer and a little bit technique-y, a little fourth wall, a little writer workshop-y, so hopefully you guys enjoyed that content, and I'll be back with some hardcore House of the Dragon conspiracy material in my next video. So make sure you're subscribed to the channel, and I'll be bringing you lots of flying D's, dragons that is, all season long.